Good afternoon to all, and I hope you're doing well. Cryptic crosswords are a wonderful hobby that engages the creative, the investigative, the logical, the puzzle-seeking, the narrative parts of ourselves. And today I had the great pleasure of talking with Rob, a very warm and generous, real person behind the cryptic pseudonym Henri. Now, Henri is a very accomplished setter or crossword puzzle maker who recently celebrated in pretty spectacular style his 100th cryptic crossword puzzle under the name Henri. And if you know anything about this endeavor, it's really a wonderful accomplishment. And Henri is excellent at all the foundations of cryptic crossword clues, but also is well regarded and highly admired, and has, I think, an enthusiastic and appreciative fan base for his inventiveness as well. A cryptic crossword clue essentially at its base has two components, and along with the answer. And one component is basically a straightforward synonym, sort of traditional definition that you'd find in a conventional crossword puzzle. And the other component is some sort of wordplay or trickery or good-natured misdirection that also gets you to the same answer. So puzzle solvers have basically two ways to get to an answer, but when you look at these things at first, they're, well, of course, very cryptic, and they often seem impossible. And for me, it was like, only geniuses can do this. But once you see that there's a logic behind it, there are some rules and some gamesmanship and patterns that eventually become, sort of recognizable and more normal, the more time you spent with it, you see that these things are, they're fascinating, they're intelligent, they're engaging, but they're not the daunting mystery that they might have originally seemed. Anyhow, I'd like to just present to you Rob, known as Henri, and I hope you enjoy and have a very good day. And thanks again to Rob. All right, Rob, Henri, what a pleasure it is to see you. Thanks so much for accepting my invitation.
Not a problem. I'm very happy to be here.
And it was very exciting for me when you did, because although I have really no idea how large or widespread or minuscule the cryptic crossword, the cryptic crossword world is, at least the part that I have access to, you made a big splash recently and deserved all the praise that I thought you were getting, that I saw you were getting, and it was very exciting.
That's kind of you. It's a very small corner of the crosswording world. I think the majority of the crosswording world is the national newspapers, and I'm not publishing the national newspapers. But in our own little amateur corner of the crossword internet, yes, I'm very active.
It's great, yeah. And so we were celebrating your 100th puzzle on a certain website. And
Yeah.
I think we'll get into that in a little bit, but I had a couple like general questions because before October 2024, I had never heard of cryptic crosswords. So never crossed my worldview at all. So this is all still very new to me. But I'm really like kind of falling sort of in love with that world. You're the first person I've ever talked to, like live, at least. I've emailed one other person. So really, I'm totally new. But my first question is like, do you have a preference as like, would you rather solve or set a puzzle, or possibly like do some mentoring as a third option?
I do a lot of solving still, like one or two regular cryptics a day, and a couple of more complicated board thematic puzzles a week. I do enjoy it hugely, but I have to say that my real passion is setting rather than solving. If I absolutely had to choose, which is a really weird thing, but if I had to, setting gives me so much enjoyment. It's the way I look at it, solving a puzzle is solving a puzzle, but setting a puzzle is solving a puzzle as well, because getting the whole thing to work getting the grid to work, getting the answers to work, getting it as a solvable thing for other people to tackle is problem solving. So I get a huge kick out of making a puzzle work. I really love doing other people's as well. But yeah, I do prefer setting as a way to pass my own time. Um, it's interesting you mentioned mentoring. It's the kind of is an element of that in the crosswording community once you get to know each other. I got a huge amount of help very early on from a couple of key people on the MyCrossword UK site, which you alluded to earlier on. Pulsemark and a set called Fez and a couple of others. There's Sudaka, there's Coot, there's Blah, there's Jugular. There's a whole bunch of people, but two or three of those in particular did test solves for me. Still do now and again, and that is a really useful thing to get, especially when you're setting out, is to get other people to critique your work before you publish it anywhere. Because everybody makes mistakes early on. Everybody makes the same rookie errors early on. But it's a very friendly community and people do help each other out. And as time's gone on, I have moved into actually helping other people with test solving theirs. So it's kind of a virtuous circle that over time,
Yeah.
people just sort of help each other out. As long as there's somebody out there that's been there before you that can help you out, they're a very giving community. Not very, it's very collaborative rather than competitive. It's people look out for each other, people help each other, and any critiquing that's done is with the best possible spirit. It's about improvement. It's about making sure people just keep improving over time. So that aspect of it is very important. But so far, I mean, I've only been setting for a few years. I've been more the mentee than the mentor.
Mhm.
But that sort of gradually changes over time, the more experience you get, I think.
Yeah, well, you were very generous. I asked you one small minor setting question, and you were extremely generous in your response. So that comes, I think that maybe comes naturally to you. And possibly in a little while, I'll get into some details of like certain types of clues. But
Yeah, that was interesting actually, because I think that was possibly the first time somebody had actually asked my advice on a particular technical point like that. I mean, previously as I said, there's a lot of people in the crossword community who talk to each other, and we do check either individual clues or whole crosswords out on each other. But I think that was interesting. That was the first time that somebody had asked me what I think was more of a general structural question about how you
yeah,
would it work if it was like this generally, and what are the rules or conventions? And actually writing it down in response to your question made me realize things that I've just kind of picked up and absorbed over time. And it's just the very fact that somebody asked me the question made me organize my own thoughts in that. And I've now got a clear idea of why some clues work well and some don't, because wrote down things that were kind of just nebulous things in my mind that somebody had asked me to articulate. So I actually quite like answering those kind of questions, as long as people accept that it's my opinion, my view, my experience, whatever. But I do find that talking about something that you're interested in actually helps your own understanding of it. So it's almost like learning by teaching kind of thing.
yeah, totally. I was thinking that as you were talking because
Yeah.
well, I'm an eighth grade teacher, and
Right.
one of the things a teacher has to learn how to do is sort of make explicit that which is sort of tacit, or as you said, kind of
Yeah.
nebulous in your head, or things
Yeah.
you've sort of picked up by experience or osmosis, or but when you're forced to articulate it, or when you're invited to articulate it, it does it does really
Yeah,
help.
yeah, and a lot of the time, the feedback you do get from other setters when you run clues by them, they'll just say that doesn't really work, and kind of let you work out yourself what that really means, what to do about it. But yeah, it was almost like your email. It was almost like being set an essay question on explaining 200 words why this device doesn't work.
And
And
just
I
as just for me to interrupt, my disclaimer to that email was like honestly, like no rush. I'm hoping to ask a 20-second question. And you probably took a good
oh
15
yeah, yeah. I mean,
minutes
you
of that.
didn't
So
give me a word count and a deadline. I
yeah,
know that.
yeah, but that was cool. But just something I'm curious about is is cryptic crossword something you were exposed to like early on in life? Are you like into puzzling or problem solving or like decrypting stuff like
Yeah,
generally?
no, the weird thing is I really only started even solving cryptic crosswords much about 3 years ago.
Okay.
Uh, so I think the slightly longer version is many, many years ago, I did kind of dabble in solving cryptic crosswords. I get The Guardian every day. That's my newspaper choice is The Guardian. They've got a very good reputation for their crosswords. And quite a while ago, I got myself to the point where I could at least solve a full crossword. It took me a long, long time, but I could solve, and it was probably the Cryptic, which is like the entry level cryptic crossword. It's gone like years and years, but I kind of got to the point where all I wanted to do was finish one crossword, and it was like
Yeah.
job done that, tick, move on, do some other stuff, and it didn't really take hold of me. And then weirdly in 2022, do you remember when Wordle was a massive thing? The New York Times
Yeah.
bought some UK software developer and for millions, whatever. Wordle, I like lots and lots of other people. I got into doing Wordle
Hmm.
every day. And looking at it very logically, I thought, rationally, I always had the same starting word. And then one day I got it in one guess because my starting word was the word. And that
Yeah.
kind of felt like, all right, I've kind of done Wordle now. I mean, I could have carried on doing it every day. And then there was some variants on Wordle that got more and more complicated. With there was two grids to solve, or there was four. And I actually graduated to this one called Sedicordal, where you were running 16 grids and
Uh,
you basically guessing the same words, but you have to solve all 16 grids. It was getting silly, really, but I was sort of craving this more difficult puzzle all the time.
Raven. Yeah.
Then, very opportunistically, the crossword editor of The Guardian did an article which was basically, if you like Wordle, why don't you try Cryptic Crossword? And I thought, vague memory that I did actually complete one many many years ago. Let's see if I can still do it. And for whatever reason, this time round, I really got bitten by the bug because I did sit down and did a Guardian crossword quicker than I thought I would. So all the techniques that I'd sort of gradually picked up the years before, they all still existed in my head somewhere. So I picked it back up very quickly.
Mm.
And it's one of those things, like a lot of things. It's about like the consistency of practice. So once I've been doing the Guardian daily crossword like every day for several weeks, I was
Mm.
getting better and better. I was doing fewer and fewer reveals. I was parsing more. And then I can't remember how I found it now. There's a fantastic resource called 15Squared. Are you aware of
Yes.
15Squared?
Yeah.
Fifteensquared was like one of the really big milestone sort of step changes in my interest in crosswords because I discovered that rather than just either get it or not get it and then move on, there was this whole forum every day where somebody explained how all the clues worked and deconstructed them, and people commented on what they thought of them and whether that was a fair clue and how that worked and just I discovered I fell down this rabbit hole of people who were better at crosswords than me, as interested in crosswords as I was becoming, and were quite happy to explain how stuff worked. They're quite happy to sort of pull back the curtain about how the clues were working, how they were written. Setters occasionally joining those discussions.
Mm.
So that was a massive step change in terms of me understanding how crosswords worked and how different kind of clue devices worked and how grid fills worked and what a good grid was. So all of that discussion just kept feeding my mind. So I had got to the point where I was solving a crossword every day. And then I started setting only about 4 or 5 months after I'd picked up the solving hobby. And it was The Guardian. They did a feature on MyCrossword.co.uk, which I had never heard of, didn't know existed. But they interviewed Tom, the guy who set up MyCrossword.co.uk, and talked about how it was a really good resource for people getting into doing crosswords and learning to set. And I thought I could do that. Very optimistically thought I'm sure I could do that. I pulled one together. It took a while, but I pulled one together. And I did get somebody to test solve it. I discovered that I had a friend of a friend who was very good at cryptic crossword.
Ah.
They did test solve my very first one. Um, and I put it up and I got some really good feedback. I mean, looking at it now, I think it's objectively terrible, but for a debut, it was reasonably well accepted. And I got bitten by the bug. And I set another within less than a week, and I set another within a few days after that. I was like, I'm in the site with these puzzles that were just pouring out of me. Um,
Mm.
And I was just getting better and better at knowing what a good clue looked like, how they work, take people's feedback, because a good thing about that site is that people do say what quibbles they had, what they thought didn't work. So I felt like I was improving just by taking the advice of all these other people that had done it before me. And then I think the next big step change was Postmark, who's the #1 setter on that site. He reached out and said politely, "You've got potential. Would you like me to do some test solving for you?"
Mm.
And he was very thorough, very constructive, but really quite detailed about why some of my clues weren't working and what I was doing wrong and the basic pitfalls that everybody does early on. Which of those I was still doing. So he told me that my clues were too long. There's a lots of filler words in there. I was using linking words unnecessarily. Some of the linking
Yeah.
words were in the wrong direction. It was saying, the wordplay and the definition were pointing in the wrong direction to each other. Wrong parts of speech. So in the wordplay, you were saying it was a verb, it became a noun in the definition. And the really key one, which he still does pull me up on, is a good surface to the crossword clue. The actual, the sentence that is the clue should be a coherent phrase. It should be a
Yes.
coherent sentence or a fragment of a sentence that you can imagine a real person saying. And I think the biggest thing I see in people starting to write crosswords is nonsensical surfaces. The, the parts of it do make sense in terms of arriving at the definition that you want, but the sentence itself is just beyond absurd. It just makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. The best surfaces are almost like miniature short stories or prompts for short stories. There's something that you can imagine actually describing an event, possibly in a slightly obtuse way, but they are phrases that you can imagine somebody saying or using or thinking in real life. So that was something that, looking back at my early ones, I wrote some absolutely terrible surfaces. And even in his last email to me, Postmark did it was he was trying to compliment me on how I'd improved, but he did say, "But you've occasionally got some very clunky surfaces still." So he's still quite forthright in his opinion of other people's puzzles, but in a good way. But yeah, he basically got me more regimented in writing better clues, not accepting the first thing I wrote, um,
Yeah.
trying to read it from the point of view of a solver. Um, but some solvers, it's really interesting talking to people about how they solve puzzles. Some solvers love a nice storytelling clue that means something. And there are others, it's different kinds of brains. Others can read a crossword clue without parsing the real meaning of it at all. They literally just look at the component parts, x plus y plus z equals answer. Um, and I can do that. I can deconstruct a clue to its parts, but I also appreciate it if it makes sense on the surface as well. So yeah, those are the big sort of milestones of my crossword life were finding 15 squared and then starting getting test solves from people. Standing on the shoulders of giants is how I see it. So.
And that's really cool that people reached out to you. Did you do any reaching out to get that reaching out in return, or were you just
Um,
saying what you could?
No, no, I think I probably published at least a dozen or so puzzles, just assuming that I knew what I was doing, or I was taking the feedback that people were giving me after they were published. So, I look back at a lot of my early puzzles, and there's lots of polite, "I see what you're trying to do there, but
Mhm.
should have done is this." But that's all after the event. It's post-published.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I kind of thought I could just carry on muddling through learning as I was going along, but Mark was very gracious in saying, like, in the nicest possible way, "You've got potential, but somebody needs to take you under their wing a little bit."
Yeah. Well, I find any bit of feedback in any direction like immensely satisfying. I think I've done maybe 9 or 10 puzzles. The first one was about the TV show Twin Peaks, and none of it made sense. But to me, it was like I did that puzzle before I learned how to solve anything, like before I solved the full puzzle. So I just jumped in and was trying to have fun with it. But over time, I've come to see how much time and effort goes into the construction of one of these puzzles. And and you never know if anyone's even going to look at it. Well, you do because you have a higher status, but you don't know who's going to look at it. You don't know what's going to land.
To start
You don't
with,
know if the little stories in your, because for me, I like stories. So every clue has like this little funny story that I imagine, but you never know which ones are going to land, and then how it's constructed, etc. So like literally any feedback is
yeah,
so
well,
appreciated
it's
for me.
interesting about specific clues. Very occasionally I start with I think I've got a great idea for a clue, and I build a whole grid around it. And I got some great
Mm,
advice from another setter, Sodaka. He said that if he thinks of a great clue, he makes that one across. So if you
yeah,
could start, if you could start the grid with what you think is your strongest clue, he said that as from a solving point of view, it doesn't need to be the easiest or the hardest, but what you think is the best, the cleverest, the
yeah,
funniest, most whimsical, or whatever. So he gave me that advice about if you think you've written a great clue, build a puzzle around it. And I have done that a few times. And I do keep, I've got a note on my phone, which is clue ideas. I know a lot of them haven't found a home yet. I'm kind of saving them until I can find a home and build something around them. Um, but yeah, a lot of the time, individual clues are very much secondary to how I build a puzzle. Um, because what I've realized is I'm not sure I'd be great at writing regular cryptic crosswords for like the UK daily papers, because they generally want something quite straightforward. And I don't mind solving those, but in what I'm setting myself, I always prefer there to be something more to it rather than just 32 clues. And a lot of the time that's a theme. So I quite often build crosswords around themes, and they're usually kind of popular culture themes. It's been TV shows, it's been movies, it's been actors, it's been. I've done individual pop songs. I have the lyrics of a pop song roll across clues in one that I did not too
mm,
long ago. So a theme, I think, is always a more interesting way of filling a grid than just finding 30 words that fit together. Um, and then the other thing that I try to do is come up with puzzles that have got some sort of special twist to them. So there's a special instruction, there's a preamble. So it could be something like 10 of the across clues generate an extra letter, and they spell a message and read the message to find out what to do, blah blah blah. And the hundredth that you were mentioning earlier on was the peak of that whole thing, that I embedded three different levels of message in it. It was almost like trying to get out of an escape room. You think you've finished it, and
yeah.
there's something else you did. Um, Generally speaking, that's as complicated as I'd want to go on a regular 15 by 15 cryptic crossword. But it was my
Mm,
100th, so I thought I'd push the boat out. But I've done quite a few where there's been just like one little twist to it. And and quite often, people assume that they're going to be much more difficult than a regular one. But as long as the instruction is relatively straightforward, I did one not too long ago where for about half the clues, I think it was all the down clues, the definition was anagrammed. And they were all very, very simple anagrams, and they were all like no more than six letters, and they resolved to straightforward words. But you did have to look at all the words in the clues to work out not just which one was the definition, but then resolve that definition into a different word in itself. So that was something that, on the face of it, I had people saying, "Oh, that looks a bit hard," and then all the feedback was that was much easier than I expected. So there
mm,
being a special instruction to it doesn't need to make it more difficult than usual. To me, I think it just makes it more interesting than usual. And I do think, having watched Martin do the cryptic mystic solve of my 100th, I think he demonstrated that, because I don't think, I think the way he solved it, that there wasn't anything particularly tough about individual clues. And I think that he demonstrated that embedding something behind the clues, in the clues, at the end of the clues, whatever, um, does not make solving clues themselves any more difficult.
yeah.
Um, and I think there's some setters that when they add a special instruction, they make it almost impenetrable and obtuse and really, really tough. I quite like using a special instruction just to add a bit of spice to it, but without making it any more difficult than usual. Um, and that's what I tried to do with the 100th puzzle, was the starting point of it was literally just finding six or eight extra hidden, was it? I can't even remember myself. There was a number of extra hidden words in certain clues which spelt an instruction, which then led you off into what else you needed to do. And interestingly, Martin actually got one of them wrong. I did correct him afterwards. He miraculously managed to misidentify one of the extra words, but still make sense of the message.
Yeah, I think he swapped the preposition for another one.
Yeah, he identified an in as an extra word when it was intentional, and he missed that there was a from, but the whole thing made sense anyway. So even making the mistake, he got all the way through to the end of that. But watching him do it was interesting. Watching other people do your crosswords is fascinating, because you'd think that most of the time it's a very solitary experience. Yes, you can set it, somebody else can test it, you can publish it, people tell you what they thought of it, but actually watching people solve it is fascinating. I loved it. I loved that. It was a really, really interesting experience doing that.
Had that experience once. Martin solved one of my puzzles on his show, and
Right.
that was amazing because I usually watch it while I'm driving to work in the morning. It just works out timing wise, and I was like in my car alone driving, kind of yelling along, like celebrating whenever something worked, and I was as nervous as I've been in as long as I can remember, believe it or not.
It's slightly nerve-wracking. And the even more exciting variant on that is when somebody does a live solve, but you can actually watch them do it and participate. So
Oh,
Cryptic
okay.
Sunday is the main one in the
I'm
UK.
sorry, I didn't hear that last thing.
Cryptic Sunday, the stream on Twitch. So there's a crosswording couple, Matt and Rachel, who do Cryptic Sunday. They solve two puzzles from MyCrossword every Sunday, and it's on Twitch. You can chat along. So a couple of times I've missed the live and I've watched it afterwards, but also sometimes I've managed to catch it while they're solving one of mine. So you can actually sort of nip in and advise them if they're not getting the clues right. But those are the times I'm really shouting at the screen that you really want to, like, oh, you're so close. But yeah, watching other people solve a puzzle is so satisfying. When they get it, when you see the pennies drop in,
Yeah.
and it's a big ego boost when somebody's like, oh, that was a clever clue. Oh, that was good. Oh, that was clever.
And
So
yeah,
yeah,
and
it's
you're almost vicariously sharing like an aha moment, because you're as the creator of the clue or the puzzle, you're having multiple moments like that yourself. And
yeah,
you find yourself laughing out loud or chuckling or chewing your pencil or whatever it might be. And when you see
exactly.
somebody else having that, it's really great.
Yeah, and just setting and solving are kind of like a mirror image of each other, because when you're setting, you start with the you start with the answer and you have to write a clue that fits it, and that can be like it's the reverse penny dropping moment when you realize that there's a way of building a question to this answer. And there's been some times when it's very geeky, but sometimes you do write a clue and you go, yes. Yes, God, that's the one. Or and on the 100th, I mean, I don't think this is a gigantic spoiler, because I don't know how many people are going to go back and actually tackle that puzzle now. But that took me about 5 different grids before I got something to work that actually spelled out the message that I wanted it to. And then whilst I was trying to write clues for that set of words, I actually realized that one of the answers could be built in as part of the message. So rather than, so the original message was going to just spell out to look at certain cells in the grid.
Mhm.
And I was going to allude to like exactly which letters to look at in the grid. And then I realized that one of my answers I could just say 6 down, because 6 down was numbers, and I wanted people to read the cells
Yeah.
with numbers. So just finding that I could actually put a word in the grid that was part of the message, I felt very, very pleased with myself and saw that, because
So
it was beast to put together. It took a lot of knocking into shape, but that was it. That was the breakthrough. I thought that's just so neat to have this multi-level message, that rather than just one or two things to find.
and I imagine that was in some respects a present to yourself, as well as like it's almost like throwing a birthday party for yourself and inviting
Yeah,
multiple
well,
people.
there is kind of a tradition on on
Oh,
my
okay.
if you hit the 50th or and I'm the first to hit 100th actually. But if there's been a lot of people who've celebrated the 50th puzzle by doing something either themed around 50 or silver or having a hidden message. But yeah, there's definitely people who've used crosswords to celebrate milestones, and I thought I actually started on it in like October last year. It was a long gestation, that particular puzzle.
Oh, I see. So then the clues themselves, at least the down clues, they all had to end with a specific letter that
Yeah,
when you took
and
those final. So I'm just curious to hear about that. How did you manage that one?
well, without wishing to go down another rabbit hole too far, the kind of crosswords I'm most like setting and solving and not the regular 15 by 15 with blocks and white cells. I really love barred thematic puzzles where there's no blocks. It's basically wall-to-wall letters, so it's like a 12 by 12 or 13 by 13 square, and it's wall-to-wall letters, and they've just got bars between them. And they're much harder to build, and they're much harder to solve as well. The words in them are much more obscure. You absolutely need a dictionary to solve those things. But in barred thematic puzzles, there's always a theme and there's always a twist and there's always something as a solver that you have to do differently to normal. So there'll be something like there's an extra letter generated by a word played by all down clues and they spell out your next instruction, or
See.
there's an extra word and the outer letters of that word could be rearranged into something that you have to highlight in the grid. Or anyway, and that was something that I wanted to bring some of that into a regular cryptic crossword. And it's actually not as difficult as you think. It's the most difficult thing there was creating a grid where I could make the numbers cells spell something. So there's various versions with various messages, but I did settle on, I think was it it's Henri's 100th crossword puzzle. No, 100th crossword. Anyway, that was 32 or something like. I had to basically make it fit into a
Yeah.
grid. If it fit into the grid was the hard thing. Writing clues. I'm definitely of the view that you can write a clue for anything. You can't
Okay.
write a great clue, but you can definitely write a clue for absolutely anything. And if you give yourself an extra limitation, like you always do when you're setting for a barred thematic. But if you do that for a regular crossword, then you just have to, it just makes you think more um, um, uh,
Inventively, perhaps.
word inventively about
Mm.
exactly what words you need in your clues. So yeah, in that particular instance, I put a message into the last letters of all the down clues. You had to read all the last letter of the down clues in order. And all that really meant was that for every clue I had to write, I'd first of all just write a version of it that made sense to me. And then it's like, I need to change the last word. I need to find a synonym for the
Oh,
last word that ends with the letter that I'm thinking of. And sometimes that works, sometimes that requires a total rewrite. But in no instance did I need to change the word in the grid. I come up with an answer for every every letter challenge I came up with an answer to. Some took a lot longer than others. Some of them, the wording is really strange. I needed an X because I needed to spell six down.
yes.
So I needed an X, and I wrote a clue that ended up with the weird construction of does perplex, and so I didn't put perplexes because that ends with an S.
Right.
I had to put a strange way of phrasing that so that it ended with a particular letter. So if you read some of those clues in isolation now, there's definitely better ways of writing them to make more sense. But I had to write them in a way that met that criteria of the last letter has to be this exact letter. Um, and you can just do it very, very methodically. And as I say, it was something I worked on and off for a while. And if you hit a wall, you just stop and put it away and come back to it another day.
Yeah.
And then yeah, eventually I had a full set of clues that worked. But yeah, it's just you've just got to be very, very patient, inventive. You've got to not mind scrapping things and starting again. So before I started writing the clues, as I said, there was five different versions of that particular crossword, and the first four just didn't work. and you can't make them work. So it was scrap it 4 times and put one that works. So yeah, you just got to be very, very patient sometimes. The muse doesn't
Yeah.
always visit, but if you're not working to a deadline, then you can knock it to shit.
Yeah. And I guess when you've written as many puzzles as you have, it's less painful, it's less excruciating to cut things. And part of being a newcomer in most endeavors is it takes so much work just to do something that's mediocre that you're really hesitant to scratch the mediocre, and thus, that's what you end up producing. But
No, I know exactly what you mean. And like a lot of things that you learn as you get better at it, your own standards get higher. So you start to there's there's like a sometimes in a lot of endeavors, and I got this with photography, I got this with crosswording. You get to a point where you're dissatisfied with your own work, and it's not because you're getting worse, it's because you know what good looks like now.
yeah,
And when you know what good looks like, you get frustrated if you're not meeting your own increasing standards. And I've been through phases like that. So you start off and you think, this is okay. And then you look back at it later and you think, well, it wasn't really, but I felt like I needed to get it out into the world. So yeah, there's been times that I've kind of hit that. And you just have to push on through it. You just have to, I mean, sometimes you have to just, either scrap a crossword or just push it out and see if people like it.
yeah.
But I'm increasingly fine with scrapping them because I do know that
Interesting.
I'd rather scrap one that I didn't think worked because the time that you put into it, it shouldn't really matter if you put out a crossword that doesn't make sense or is mediocre or people don't enjoy. You can't really just mitigate that by saying, "But I spent so long doing that." You know,
Yeah.
you've got to respect Solver's time as well as your own.
Yes, that's very well said. Um, Feel free to answer none of the above, but I have a multiple choice question for you. Is setting a crossword, creating a crossword puzzle in the cryptic style, is it more art, science, computer programming, or something
Um,
else, or none of the above? For you, maybe.
it's for me, I think it's a very unique mix of being very creative and being very logical. It's a strange combination of art and craft and science and logic and literacy.
Mm,
It's got some very strict rules on how things work and certainly conventions, but it's things have got to fit into certain structures. That's the very point of crosswords is that there's a right answer that fits into the grid, a wrong answer shouldn't be put in there. But there's an art to writing them that I think is very creative, and I think you've alluded to it before, but a good good crossword clue is like a mini story.
mm,
And I think there is definitely an art which is something like minimalist writing to get a crossword clue to work. So I think there's definitely an artistic side to it. But you also need to be a very rational, logical thinker. I've seen, I think the least successful beginners I've seen starting out writing crosswords are the ones who try to bend the rules straight away.
mm.
And the longer I do it, the more I'm actually inclined to keep following the conventions that
See.
exist. They exist for really, really good reasons. But early on, there's quite a lot of people. I did this to a certain extent. It was like, rules, well, I care about rules. But the point is that, there's this whole body of logic around how crosswords work that solvers expect puzzles to work within. So I do think there's a very, very logical side to it. Your mind does need to work in quite an organized way, but it's creative as well. So it's a strange mix of art and craft.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. And the rules have lasted, and the genre or the form has lasted over time. And there's something to say about tradition and things, and traditions being tested over time and standing the test of time, and then being nipped at the edge. So all of that is just interesting in itself to me.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, I find it endlessly fascinating. I think it's it's a hobby I found relatively late in life, and I'm not sure how much I would have enjoyed it if I found it a couple of decades ago. But it's I find it really sort of feeds my mind. I find it's a really great way of keeping your brain active. I'm glad I found it. I'm glad I've become not reasonably competent at it, and other people enjoy the
Mhm.
puzzles. Um, but yeah, I think it's a great way to carry on learning stuff as well. I mean, my vocabulary, I've learned so much new stuff over the last few years. Not much used to anything, but it's feeds the brain. So yeah,
Nice.
I love it. I'm really glad I found this hobby.
Yeah, that's cool. And you know, you're in a state of learning and creating, which is a really nice combination. You know,
Yeah, I mean,
amongst
it's
the many
very
other
niche.
pleasures.
It's when I tell people this is what I do, I get some strange
Yeah.
looks. I'm not sure it's everybody's cup of tea, but
Do you know
uh,
anybody in real life who was into this? You know, in
no,
like
the only people that I've encountered whilst I've started doing this are people that I'm kind of remote friends with. I've never met any of them in real life. I'd like to. I mean, there are actually some crossword conferences, get-togethers in the UK. I'm in France, and I've never quite been organised enough to get back over there in time for those. But I'd quite like to be in a room with a bunch of people that I've been talking to online for the last few years and see them face to face. Because it's a weird thing that it's very much an individual hobby, and yet
Mhm.
there is this community around it. And at some point, I would actually quite like to put some faces to names.
Yeah, that's why this was really cool for me. I always find myself on YouTube because the things that I get into, the things that capture my interest, I can't find anybody in real life, you know, in my vicinity to
Yeah,
talk about these things with. So that's what the internet is good for.
and
Not that I want to be on the internet all the time, but you know that there is a benefit to, you know, we're across the ocean right now. And that's
yeah, the irony is I only got into doing cryptic crosswords when I lived in a different country. There's
Hmm,
kind of a way in which I keep connected to my mother tongue. It's
okay.
I live in a different country. I have to speak French quite a lot over here. But I really like the fact that I'm doing something in English for English people and keeping that connection back to my mother tongue. But it's ironic that I'm not going to bump into many crossworders in France. Cryptic crosswords are a very English thing. Even French crosswords
Yes.
are they're their own thing again. I don't even understand French crosswords. So yeah, it's a hobby that I've got that all my friends are virtual.
Yeah, I have two little segments in mind if we have the time. And the first one is sort of like cryptics for beginners, just to get a couple words from you on that. And then
Right.
possibly like cryptics for like seasoned veterans. But if you were and I'm looking down a lot because I have some questions written, so I hope that doesn't come across as rude at all.
That's
But
fine.
if you were to describe cryptics, you know, like in a somewhat quick but accessible way for younger people, because
All students arriving the late bus,
one sec.
please report to the cafeteria now, please. All students for late bus, please report to the cafeteria now, please.
Do you remember those days?
Very long
Um,
time ago.
yeah, so I share a lot of this stuff with my students who are 13 years old on average.
Right.
So it's interesting trying to translate this for myself as a newcomer, but also for younger people. Um, but if you were to
Uh,
describe the cryptic crossword thing, like for younger or for adults that are new to this, how would you sort of like simply put it, or
it's
not
a really,
simply?
really tricky one. It's I think it's such a, a personal experience. Unless you're literally going to sit down with somebody and say, "Do you want to help me solve this crossword?" and I'll talk you through it. It's a really difficult thing to try to describe what is interesting about it. It all takes place in your own head, really. So I think it's a very, very difficult. I've never tried talking anybody into doing it. I think and actually trying to persuade somebody much younger than me that the idea of keeping your brain active and learning new stuff, that might not be what people want out of a hobby at younger ages, younger stages of
Yeah,
life. So yeah, it's a very it's such a personal thing. I mean, I have had people who I know who've asked me since I've started setting, um, to help them get into it. Well, how do I so they've expressed an interest, and it's like, and where do I go from here? How do I get better? And I don't mind offering advice to people who have expressed an interest and just want to get that first foot on the ladder. There's certain key things that I could recommend people to do to get used to it, comfortable with it, and sort of learn as you're going along. I think the idea of trying to persuade someone to just sit down and try one is actually beyond me. But if somebody asked me what was interesting about it, I think what I love about it is it's problem solving, but in an interesting way where you learn stuff. Um, it's it's not like Sudoku, which just placing numbers in a grid so that they follow some sort of logic. You learn new words, you learn new ways of saying things. You spot interesting connections between words if you're interested at all in the roots of words and etymology of words. But I do think you need to have that kind of mind to some degree in the first place. But yeah, if you're interested and you want to know how to get started, I'd be really happy to tell people what those baby steps are to not get frustrated and disillusioned. It's like, don't sit down and try to do the Times crossword on day one, because it'll just make you feel stupid. But do start with, there's a quick cryptic in the Guardian. There's one of the UK daily papers does a 5-word cryptic. It's like this tiny grid with like 5 clues. So there's ways of getting started where you don't get that sort of frustration of just, this doesn't make sense. But yeah, I do think somebody has to have that spark of interest for me to even be able to begin explaining what's cool about it.
Yeah, I stumbled randomly upon Martin Gallagher's Cryptic Mystic YouTube channel, and I'm like, what the heck is this?
All
And
right.
an hour later, he's finishing up a puzzle, and I'm like, that was amazing.
Yeah,
I'm like,
because there is a
these people
big
must be geniuses, and then you start to see
cryptic
that there are
crossword
ways to.
tradition in the US, is there? It's very much a British thing, cryptics.
Yeah, I never heard of it, and I don't even know how old I am, almost 50, and I never heard of it. I'm not very worldly either, but yeah, it's not in our faces at all. So
No, it is very, very British. I've tried to explain to French people the whole idea behind them, and they just glaze over when you're trying to explain about how
I usually,
the clues are deliberately misleading, that you have to think about what other words mean. But I do think there's something about crosswords that I think English as a language is perfectly suited for, because crosswords rely on synonyms. And English is such a hybrid language, it's such a mongrel language, that there's multiple words for the same thing. So there's lots and lots of words of saying the same thing just because of all the different languages that fed into English. And most other languages have got a small vocabulary base than English has. So I think the language is by far the best for the type of puzzle that Cryptic Crossword is, because there's so many ways of disguising what you're saying
yeah.
that other languages, they don't have that pool of words to play with.
And one question I have written down is actually about synonyms and the extent to which, like, you personally are comfortable using a synonym that's somewhat remote. Like, technically it's a synonym, but it's a bit of a stretch, because
Um,
I like the website Word Hippo, which just
yeah,
gives you a ton of synonyms. But if you scroll down like too far, it's like pretty far afield from the
yeah,
original. But that's like
yeah.
it seems like a personal taste point almost, because I've seen
I
some
think
really. I'm
it's
sorry. I'm sorry. I keep rambling on, but I've seen like a couple really high end puzzles that part of why they're hard is they have the trust in themselves maybe and the solver to stretch the synonym a little bit.
Yeah, so I think it might be personal preference, but I do think you can deliberately engineer it around difficulty.
Mm.
And I can't remember the first person who said this to me. I've heard it a few times over the last few years. But a great maxim is, hard words need easy clues, and
Ah,
easy words need hard clues.
good.
So I'd be really happy if I had like a 3 or 4 letter word to clue. It was a very, very everyday word. I'd look for the most obscure synonym I could think of
Let's see.
that I would
Okay.
reasonably expect a solver to think of, um, because I need a way of making it more difficult. And it just needs to make sense. It just needs to be a substitution test where you could have used that word in a sentence. It doesn't need to be
Yeah.
a direct synonym in every single scenario. It just needs to have that meaning to it. And a good example is I was putting a puzzle together recently where there was I need to clue the fragment foot. And in the end, this actually, I was collaborating with somebody else on this. This was actually, there's two of us writing the clues, which doesn't happen very often, but when you do, you sort of it challenges you to come up with like more interesting clues because somebody else is like writing them with you. And that was a situation where we decided that we didn't just want to clue the word foot as in it's on the end of your leg or it's on the bottom of your shoe. It was a situation we wanted to disguise the word as much as possible. And we ended up using the concept of pay, meaning foot. Pay the bill, foot the bill. So pay and foot are only synonymous in that context.
Yes.
But it's acceptable in cryptic crosswords to put the word pay in the clue when you want foot in the answer. But when a word's really obscure, I think you need to clue it in as simple way as possible. So you can dial up and down the difficulty by the synonym being really obvious or not. But I'd base that on, do you want to make this clue? Do you want to make an easy word look harder? Do you want to make a harder word look easier? The other really important thing about synonyms, there's basically two types of cryptic crossword clue. There's probably lots of ways of dividing this, but there's the clues where the letters are in the clue in plain sight, and it's just a way of extracting them and putting them in the right order. So clue types like anagrams or hiddens, or when it's an acrostic, and it's like single letter indicators when you just, all you need to do is add, or alternation. And the instruction will just be which of the letters that are there in plain sight need to be extracted to come up with the answer. They are inherently easier than I've thought of a synonym, you need to think of the same one.
Yeah.
So for clues, for words that are obscure, I'd avoid using a synonym-based approach at all. I'd just look for how can I make this so somebody can just look at the clue and logically pull out the right letters and say that's the answer. Even so a good clue for an obscure word is the solver is very confident they've got the right answer, even if they've never heard that word before, because they know that it said it's hidden between these two words, and it's that string of 6 letters. I've never heard that before. I'll take it on trust that that's some sort of South American bird, but that is a word that fits, and there's no confusion around that being the answer. When there's an obscure word and you use a synonym to get to it, you make it doubly difficult because the synonym has to be, I've thought of this, will you think of the same one? And then you've got to make that work for a clue that people might not even recognize the word in the first place. So synonym-based clues are basically the more advanced than some of the clue types anyway. And if you want to keep things simple, use the clue types where the letters are in the clue in the first place.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. You shared a nice tip about double definition clues with me. And, earlier tonight you said when you put it into writing to send that message to me, it clarified itself a little bit for you. Is that something you'd like to keep personal, or would you mind sharing that here?
I don't mind sharing it at all. I think the simple question was you gave me a sample clue that had 3 definitions, but a linking word between 2 of them. Multiple definitions is a totally valid clue type, but in most clues there's wordplay and definition, and one leads to the other, or one is a result of the other, and there's a directionality to the linking words about one creating the other, or one being a creation of the first. And in double definition, well, multiple definition clues generally, they're usually double definitions. For double definition clues, the convention is that there shouldn't be a linking word, because you're not saying that this leads to that. You're saying this is the same as that. So you'd either just have the 2 words, and you can disguise it to the point where you might have a noun that looks like an adjective, and an adjective that looks like a verb, or whatever. But the phrase looks like it means something, but actually you come up with 2 words that mean the same thing. I think it's acceptable to use a linking word between definitions if you're using a linking word that means equality, not transformation. So A is B, A is the same as B, A and B. that can make sense. Saying definition one leads to definition two, or definition two is a result of definition one, is not grammatically correct.
You were saying also that the first word in a double definition, it's nice if it's a noun, not always, but it's nice if it's a noun that functions as like a verb or an adjective within the clue.
Yeah,
That tends to be a good pattern.
It can be very, very misleading with double definitions about it, and that is a synonym based approach. So it is reasonably advanced. That you've got to think of two synonyms that arrive at the two things that mean a third thing, that it matches both A and B. So it's one of the more advanced clue types, generally more difficult to pull off than you think, because writing them without a link word or a simple equation link word rather than a transformation link word is more difficult than it looks. It's one of those less is more things that writing that concisely is a challenge in itself. Writing clues that have got link words is far easier.
And not only did you give me that advice, but you also shared with me a puzzle that you created that was filled with two. Every clue was only two words, so it was probably like 75-80% double definitions and some
It was,
cryptic
and
definitions.
that was the result of a little arms race between setters. Somebody came up with a puzzle where every clue had 5 words, and then somebody did 4, and then somebody did 3, and I picked up the baton and wrote 32-word clues. And I mean, some of them were objectively terrible, and I covered it with apologies. It was an experiment. Somebody had to do it. But yeah, they were mostly double definitions, and that some of them were terrible, but I thought some of them were reasonable examples of that clue device, and they kind of worked in the way that I've described earlier on. That they're actually 2 nouns, but one of them looks like an adjective, or one of them looks like a verb. But yeah, that was tricky. That was very, very tricky. Not my finest work by any means, but that was just somewhere I thought you got to stretch yourself and try silly things sometimes.
Yeah, and that, not to put you on the spot, but at the moment, are there any puzzles that we're doing innovative or fun or even like gimmicky? I don't mean gimmicky in a negative way. Things that you remember that you'd like to tell me about that other people did or yourself?
So there's a couple of things, a few people on MyCrossword. There's a setter called so he actually goes by TPG, which is confusing because that's kind of you as well. But his full username is the Poisoned Gift. He does some very interesting tricksy things sometimes. Things like there's certain letters missing from the words, or things around the grid, like in certain places that spell, there's like messages around the grid. The other one is Fez, who I mentioned earlier on. Fez does a lot of special instruction based stuff where there's some clues that you fill the grid, and then at the end you have to change some of the words in a certain way. I really like that. So Fez is actually, this is giving away a little bit of a secret here, but Fez and Henri collaborate under the username Mort. We've just published one yesterday. Mort is me and Fez basically both really going deep into that special instruction wacky theme kind of idea, because we both love that sort of thing. But yeah, I think it's us 3 are probably the ones that push the boundaries most on there. But I think if I give you too much information about exactly what the tricks are, if you ever went back and solved any of those, they'd be spoilers.
Yeah.
So, I'll just say that they're always interesting and there's always a twist.
Yeah, that's cool. I did have one last question on this topic, and I do appreciate your time very much. I know it's probably late, but I have noticed, I'm going to read this because, yeah, one thing I've noticed with like tougher clues is that they tend to disguise the definition more than maybe more average or accessible or designedly easier clues. And a lot of times the definition or like the link word is sort of, or the link word I would say is not an indicating that a definition is following, but the link word is actually part of the definition itself.
Yeah.
That's very tricky stuff. And
Yeah, so there is definitely a specific technique to make the to disguise the definition as much as possible. The definition's almost always at the beginning or the end of a clue. So one of the very pragmatic things that Martin was saying when he was doing his videos about teaching people how to solve cryptic crosswords is first thing you do is work out which end of the clue is the definition and kind of work from there. It can be very, very obvious if it's a relatively short clue. It can be very obvious if there's a link word because it's going to be the thing after that or straight before that. So disguising the definition by making it longer is a technique. So a long definition for a short word with very short wordplay. People will really, really often misread it and assume that like the word at the end is the definition, and actually you've made a string of like 5 or 6 words the definition. So yeah, making the definition contain words that look like they belong somewhere else in the clue is a technique. Similar, but not exactly the same, but a similar thing that a lot of people do to make clues trickier is to use words that have usually got a very specific indicator meaning in most clues, but actually you don't use it that way. So there's lots of words that scream out that it's going to be an anagram or it's going to be a reversal or it's going to be an alternation, but actually you might be using that word in a different way. So you might include the word occasionally in a clue and people think, oh, it's every other letter. But actually, we want people to take the first and last letter of occasionally because you've said somewhere else that it's the outer letters. So deliberately putting in words that look like they mean something when they mean something else is a technique. I once quite early on, I think probably one of the first really tricksy puzzles I did. I wrote a puzzle where every one of the across clues looked like it had an anagram because I used really obvious anagram indicators, but there were no anagrams in the clues at all. So then there was 16 fake anagrams and no actual anagrams. But then down the left and right hand side, I'd spelt 2 anagrams of the word anagram. So it was like nag-aram and so yeah, the idea of misleading people by using words that their immediate thought is, I know what that clue means. I've written whole puzzles where I've bent the words to mean something completely different. It's a bit naughty though.
Yeah, but you learn not to be worried, I guess, after a while, and because there is that, I don't know. Is there ever an emotional element to to either solving or constructing? And I don't necessarily mean heavy emotions, but like,
No, it's interesting. I know some setters who take it very seriously in as much as they want their puzzles to be liked and solved, and they're very keen on the like numbers and they take feedback to heart and all of that. I personally I get so much satisfaction out of just setting the puzzle. I just set them, put them out there. And if people like them, that's a bonus. So for me, the enjoyment I get is purely to do with feeling like I've done a good job in making the puzzle work. Um, and I'm quite pragmatic about just then putting that out and then moving on to the next one. So yeah, I've had my fun by the time the puzzle's published.
yeah.
And yeah, it's nice to get feedback, but I don't take it very seriously or emotionally. No.
Are you? Well, I've had moments within the construction of like a single clue where I've had, from laughter to like anger, within the span of like 10 seconds, but I guess that evens out. Um, but that's part of the appeal for me because it's like it's a puzzle within itself.
Exactly.
There's there's the story that is sort of implicit in the surface of the clue, but then there's the story of like actually constructing the clue, which is sometimes
Yeah.
a little more dramatic than others.
Yeah,
But
I know what you mean. I think that the closest I get is the very occasional sort of mini punch when I think
yeah,
I cracked something. I allow myself a little, but yeah, it's I wouldn't say it's a highly emotional activity for me. It's a
yeah,
great way to spend time. It's a great way to keep my brain occupied.
I was I was
And that's,
wondering, and feel free to ignore this question, but like, is that kind of who you are as a person in general? Like, you try to, if you're gonna put your mind to something, you try to achieve inner satisfaction, or you have certain standards.
um,
Or is that like certain realms of life you're like that, and others a little looser?
no, I think when I look back at things that have interested me in other aspects of my life and how similar they are to this, I think there's a couple of threads. One is I really like learning. I like learning new stuff. Even if it's not something you can particularly apply, I just like absorbing new information. I like learning new facts, new ways of doing things. I did a second degree in my 40s because I just decided that I wanted to
Okay.
learn how to do something new and did that for a little while. And learning how to do crossword setting, it's kind of double learning because there's learning how to do it, but it's also the little factoids and vocabulary that you learn as you're doing it as well. So the idea of always learning something. It has been a big part of what hobbies I've enjoyed over my whole life, and it particularly applies to crosswords. The other thing that I didn't realize straight away, but when I lived in the UK, moved over here like 5 years ago. When I lived in the UK for about 10 or 12 years, me and a friend of mine we used to write and host a pub quiz. Oh, your lights have gone off. Oh, no, you're back on.
I'm back.
Um, So I used to really enjoy writing the questions for a pub quiz. I used to enjoy
Yeah.
researching them. I used to enjoy coming up with like devious and evil ways of phrasing questions. So I got a lot of enjoyment out of not just researching the questions, but that actual sense of being there in person and asking people the questions. And there's kind of if I'm honest, there is kind of a power kick about being the person with the answers. And it's like I've got the answers. I want to know if you've got the answers as well. So I did get a big kick out of that. There is absolutely no culture of pub quizzes in France at all. That just isn't a thing. And I had a little bit of a gap in my life for a little while. Then I realized after a while that I'd parlayed that whole thing into writing crosswords instead because it's a similar thing. It's not standing up in front of a room of drinkers, but it is
It is in a
basically
way, yeah.
in a way, it's much more it's probably more intellectual. It's certainly more yeah, it's more cerebral than most pub quizzes. But I get a similar kick out of that whole asking the questions and seeing if people know the answers kind of thing.
Yeah.
So there's something there about enjoying feeling intellectually superior.
That's very cool. That really makes a lot of sense, for that pop quiz element sort of missing from your life, and then filling it with
Yeah.
something else, even if it wasn't
But
deliberate.
I get to do this more. I mean, I was doing that like that was a once a month gig. This is something
Yeah.
I could write a crossword a week if I want, and somebody will solve it. So.
Yeah. It's I'm going to read my last question here, and I have others, but I skipped a few. Is there anything you think our audience would enjoy, or that you would like them to know or hear? Anything else?
Um, no, to your earlier question, if anybody is interested in getting started. Probably not so much to go into great detail now, but I can certainly give you some links to pop in the notes on what I think are good first steps of getting started. To find out you're interested enough to go any deeper. Um, uh, but it's difficult without getting into geeky detail to articulate exactly what those recommendations would be. But there's definitely some tips on where I think you can find out if it's something you're interested in. I personally love it. I'm glad I found this hobby. It isn't for everybody. I get a lot out of it. And yeah, I'm very happy for any of my tips that I found I'm going along to be passed on. So I'll send you some notes that you can pop some links in the in the video notes.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And again, I have to thank you. You are the first person that I've had live communication with as far as like the cryptic crossword world
And you're
was
the
that.
first person who showed enough interest to actually ask me these questions, so that's good.
Oh, okay. Well, how was this for you? Did you enjoy this?
Yeah, it was great. I've I've never had anybody ask me so many questions about something that I'm interested in one go. It's been very useful for me, as I said before, to even sort of put straight in my mind some of the ideas and thoughts that I've had about this. You have to organize your thoughts when you're explaining things to somebody else. So I've found it useful, just articulating things that have just been bounced around my head. That I've never needed to organize into coherent thoughts before. So it's been educational for me, just listening to myself.
Good, good. I'm really glad to hear that. If there was maybe one or two people that you would hope would watch at least part of this, anybody coming to mind?
No, in fact, the weirdest part about this entire process to me is anybody who knows me as Henri and has solved any of my puzzles actually realizing that I'm a real life person that's got, a face and a voice and wears glasses. And I don't mind anybody watching it at all, but I'm almost breaking one of the codes of crosswords by being being public talking about it. It's not quite like the magic circle, but there's definitely this element of hiding behind pseudonyms that exists. So no, I'm happy for anybody who wants to watch it. But it's equally slightly scary that that Henri is a real person who happens to be me rather than just my pseudonym.
Makes sense. Well, we'll be in touch, and if we want to make any amendments to anything or even the whole thing, we'll have the opportunity to do so.
Yeah,
My plan is to move forward and eventually put this together and share it with anybody that might be interested.
I'm very happy with everything we've discussed. But yeah, it'd be cool to see it actually get it out to the world. If anybody finds it interesting, that's a bonus. I mean, it's a bit like I said about writing crosswords. I've enjoyed this experience. If anybody else gets anything out of it, that's also nice.
That's how I feel. Yeah, I could totally relate to that. Yeah. Cool. But it must be super late by you. I really do appreciate your time, and it's nice getting to know you also. It's as I say, it's cool that other people who are interested in crosswords have got faces and voices and wear glasses and are human beings. Yeah, we'll keep in touch. Thanks again, Henri.
Thank you very much. Look after yourself.
Okay, take care, man.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Appreciate it.